All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started just so that we can stay pretty close to time. My name is Jasper Collier, and I'm the Oral History Project Manager for Humanities DC, the State Humanities Council for Washington, DC. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of the DC Oral History Collaborative Coffee Chat. The Coffee Chat highlights the work of those working to document and preserve Washington's stories through oral history. We will hear a presentation from today's panel, and time permitting, we'll have a brief moderated conversation, but then we definitely want to leave ample time for questions and comments from the audience. I did want to mention that today's conversation is being recorded and will be made available to the public. And if you don't want to be on the recording, please feel free to keep your camera off. Please use the chat throughout the program for comments and discussion. But when we get to the Q&A portion, you'll want to use that Q&A feature to ask questions that you'd like the panel to answer. We also have the ability for you to use the raise hand feature if you'd like to come on and ask your question aloud as well. And we'll get to that when we get to the Q&A portion, but please feel free to use that chat throughout for comments and discussion. I'd also like to thank Humanities DC's programs coordinator, Tracy Mullery, for producing this program, and also to our ASL interpreters today, Audrey Bastian and Derek Kanian. I want to start by briefly talking about the DC Oral History Collaborative 2. It's Washington's citywide oral history project. Tell you a little bit about its role encouraging and supporting projects like the one you'll hear about today. The collaborative began in 2017 as a partnership between Humanities DC, the DC Public Library, and the DC History Center. Its overarching goal is to encourage DC residents and communities to tell their stories through oral history. The collaborative has sought to achieve this by surveying existing collections of DC oral histories, providing free public training opportunities, and by offering grants that are supported by additional training and mentorship. To date, the collaborative has supported over 50 projects across the city that have collected nearly 300 individual interviews. Almost half of these have been added to the People's Archive of the DC Public Library, where they are accessible through the library's catalog of digital resources, which is called Dig DC. Joining us this morning are Allison LaCroix and Ann Daubertine, the project leads for the Heurich House Museum's Home Brewed Oral History Project. So, I'll give you a little background on both of them. Allison is the collections manager at the Heurich House Museum, responsible for the stewardship of the museum's object archive and photograph collections. Allison has been with the Heurich House Museum since 2017 and has contributed towards improving the care, maintenance, and access to the museum's collections, as well as professionalizing the collections management processes and procedures at the museum. Prior to her work at the museum, Allison obtained a Master of Arts in History and Museum Studies in 2015 and has over 6 years of collections work experience in a variety of institutions with diverse collections. Ann Daubertine is a public historian who is currently pursuing a PhD in history at George Mason University. Her research focuses on the visual culture of the 19th and 20th century US cities. Before beginning her doctoral studies, Ann served as assistant curator of the Albert H. Small Washingtoniana collection at the George Washington University Museum. She has also done other public history work at various organizations in Washington, DC, most recently as an oral historian with the Heurich House Museum. She also works as the sound editor for Public History in a Virtual Age. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Allison.
All right, thank you so much, Jasper, and everyone for having us. Thanks for showing up on your Saturday morning. So the Heurich House Museum is a nonprofit historic house museum located in Washington, DC, right off of DuPont Circle. The Heurich Mansion was built in 1894, and it was the family home of German immigrant and brewer Christian Heurich, who in his time was the largest non-governmental landowner and employer in DC. And so for the last several years, the museum's mission and focus on exploring his legacy and his life as an example of the American dream realized. However, this focus left out many people important to Heurich's success, including his wives, household staff, and importantly, his brewery workers. So earlier last year, we shifted our museum's mission to expand the stories we tell, giving voices to people who lived and worked alongside Heurich, and to use their stories as a vehicle to kind of explore the true meaning of the American dream in both DC and beyond. This mission aligned perfectly with the goals of the DC Oral History Collaborative, and it gave us the opportunity to conduct oral histories with descendants of the brewery workers and other family members with first or secondhand knowledge of what it was like to work at the Christian Heurich Brewing Company. The picture that you see on the screen now is one of the last iterations of the brewery there. And so Anne Daratine was a huge help to the museum. Anne previously had been a docent with us at the Heurich House, and she had a demonstrated interest in oral history. And so she took on the responsibility of reaching out to our connections and actually conducting all of the interviews for us. So about the project a little more generally, until recently at the museum, we really only had basic information on some of the workers at the brewery and nothing really on display from the brewery. This was in part because of the museum's mission was focusing more on telling the story of the family and interpreting the family's home and furnishings, but also because the resources for interpreting the brewery's history were extremely limited. There was a massive fire in the brewery's archives building back in 1938, which destroyed all of the records from the brewery's founding onward. And then later in 1961, the brewery itself was torn down to make way for the Theodore Roosevelt Bridge and is now the site of the Kennedy Center. So the brewery itself is no longer standing. However, over time, some of the things that survived these events have been coming out of the woodwork a little bit, including personal stories via oral histories and some objects that were kept in private hands or either passed down through generations or collected by private collectors. So this brings us to 2018, when the museum actually acquired its first significant collection of brewery ephemera called Breweriana. It's kind of a funny word, but it's just anything related to the brewery. So we acquired this collection from a local private collector named Jack Blush, who had spent the last 40 years accumulating over 1,000 objects from the Christian Heurich Brewing Company. This purchase by the museum of the collection really shifted the museum's focus. And with that, we launched our exhibit, Brewed, which is where we get kind of the title from this whole project. As you can see, there were many, many things in the collection. And so this allowed us to give public access to these items, bits of history from the brewery for the first time. And what was immediately striking to me about this collection, however, were the silences that came with it. While we gained over 1,000 objects, we didn't really know any more about the brewery or anything and what it was like to work there than before we had gained these objects. So this oral history grant really gave us the perfect opportunity to try and rectify that. And we plan to incorporate the information from the interviews into the Brewed exhibit once we reopen to the public. And additionally, the museum will keep copies of these interviews in our archives, which are publicly accessible and may be used by researchers at any time.
So I'm going to start to transition into some themes that we learned about through these oral histories, and we're going to play you guys some clips. There's still a lot that we're learning about some of the major themes that appeared in the interviews, but there are a few that we're going to talk about that have really helped add to the museum's broader understanding of the life experience of the workers. One notable theme that emerged was actually gender in the brewery. Offering a unique insight into this topic was Heurich's granddaughter, Jan.
So let's kind of start broadly. What do you remember about the brewery? How often would you visit while it was in operation?
It was for men only. And the few times that I had any experience there was not in the brewery at all, because that was the men's place, but was taking grandfather to the brewery, because I was even ever in the brewery, maybe once. We did take our fur coats went to the brewery once a year because there was a cold room there for some reason of making beer, and so we could put our coat instead of taking them to Garfinkel's. And in those days, you always put your fur coats in cold storage in the summer. because the heat apparently was not good for them.
Oh,
But anyway,
interesting.
now I did go to the brewery once a year because they had a Christmas party for the employees. At one of the few times that I went to the Christmas party, my Uncle Chris announced my engagement to Ben Evans. And that must have been about around 1950, when I was a senior at Cathedral School. But other than that, I was never. No women were ever in the brewery. It was a man's fortress, and.
You know, another aspect that was interesting for me as an interviewer was to hear how she felt about the lack of inclusion at the brewery. It didn't really seem to bother her.
If you took a tour, maybe you got beer. I don't know, because I don't know whether they ever had tours, but it wasn't a woman's place. Mm-hmm. Women didn't do things like that.
So, yeah, that's interesting. Did you ever kind of resent that and wish that you could go in or be more involved?
No. You grew up taking that for granted.
So I was so glad that Anne asked that question of Jan, because that comment really struck me as I realized, like, among the numerous oral histories and personal conversations I had had with Jan over the years, that she never really talked about the brewery. And I realized that I had never really asked her either. I had fallen into the same traps as just kind of taking for granted that she wasn't as interested in the brewery, that she didn't have as many experiences, even though, you know, she was alive. She had firsthand, you know, experiences living contemporarily with, you know, her grandfather and being at the brewery. But so I found it really interesting to specifically have Anne ask her those questions and ask how she felt about not being part of that world, and didn't seem to bother her in the least. And it struck me that pretty much all of her stories that she remembers directly in connection with the brewery were of a very feminine nature, storing her fur coats, having her engagement party, Christmas parties. And I thought that was really fascinating. But Jan certainly wasn't alone either in having that impression that women were not part of the brewery sphere. She did have, you know, unique insight into her side of it, but Anne asked that question of all of the brewers, all of the interviewers. And we asked Bill Jones, the son of the last employee of Christian Heurich Brewing Company, Parker Jones, if he knew anything about women working in the brewery. And he responded with, "I don't think so. He never mentioned anything about women," that being his father. And similarly, Paula Jacobs, the granddaughter of the master brewer at the brewery, responded, "Certainly not women. I've never heard anything about that." So it was a common theme that just wasn't really talked about much.
Yeah, that was really interesting for me to hear as well. Another theme, kind of going along with gender and the brewery to emerge, was a look at what life was like inside the male-dominated world of working in that brewery. So we'll hear first from Mark Kaiser. Mark Kaiser was Amelia Heurich, so Christian Heurich's wife, Amelia's grandnephew. His father was Amelia's brother, who also worked in the brewery.
Can you share any memories that you have of what you heard about the employees?
Well, it seems to me that they were looked upon as a real large family. But other than that, I don't remember hearing about any labor strife or anything like that. I sort of I would have a difficult time imagining that there would have been, because as I say, Christians seem to be pretty even-handed with everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So as I say, unfortunately, my memories of the brewery are really fleeting.
Another side of the story comes from Paula Jacobs. Paula, who Allison just mentioned, is the granddaughter of the master brewer Paul Kaiser, who worked at the Christian Heurich Brewing Company in the 1930s and was tasked with getting it operational again after Prohibition. Her perspective is particularly unique. She had limited oral histories and family accounts from her father and grandfather, but her grandfather, Paul, left an unpublished family memoir that she has. It includes firsthand accounts of life working in various breweries, among them the Heurich Brewery, immediately after Prohibition. And she reads a relevant part of that memoir here.
I was offered the position of brewmaster or chemist, as now called, at Heurich's in Washington. It had one time been a fine plant, but when I went there, it was more of a storage warehouse full of old fixtures. The malt bin still had malt filled with weevils, old hops not fit for use. At one time, they sold an apple drink, which had turned to cider, and in addition, it eaten the iron rods, which is what I already said.
Mm-hmm.
Old Mr. Heurich, who was one of the richest men in D.C. at the time, was very tight-fisted and wanted me to use these things. So I had to work at night to get rid and burn what I could. It took a long time to get the brewery in decent working condition. While I was in D.C. getting the plant ready, Marie was busy getting rid of things in Philadelphia.
Definitely a contrast between Paula's account and what Mark shared. Now, a third side to this picture of life as an employee comes from Bill Jones, whose father began in an entry-level job and became the controller of the company and was actually the last employee of the company.
Yeah, my dad used to always joke about this. So I've seen some pictures of the brewery in the inside and the I guess the brew rooms with the big copper kettles and stuff. And apparently there was different levels of balconies. And I guess Old Man Heurich would. It sounded like he did inspected when he was there. He'd go and inspect around the facility during the day. He probably had a reputation for carrying firecrackers in his suit jacket. And I think he smoked cigars too. And if he saw some workers down below kind of loitering and, goofing off, he'd light one off and drop it from the balcony. And I guess after it went off, he'd tell them to get back to work. So, but that's the old Deutschland of, in German, alles in Ordnung. Everything has to be in its place, in hard work. So I'm sure that was his way. And anyway, that's one story I remember my father telling on repeated occasions about old man Heurich dropping firecrackers to get the employees back to work.
I love that story. Another story from Bill gave us a look at other kinds of jobs and work performed and how family connections could facilitate getting a job with the company.
Well, I'd like to kind of bring it back a little bit to his experiences at, like, when he was working at the brewery. You mentioned another story about sweeping yeast suds out of the tunnel that led to the Potomac River.
Yeah, I don't know where this is, but I remember him talking about it. So this must have been, early on when he was doing a lot of menial jobs when he first started working at the brewery, and one of them was sweeping out this effluent tunnel where I guess maybe yeast suds built up or something. And so, I mean, this will be somewhere where the Kennedy Center is today.
Yeah.
There's apparently a tunnel that stretched from the brewery down to the river. And he said he would start with a broom in the brewery and just keep sweeping. And eventually you came out at the river and you just sweep all that stuff out into the river. So
I wonder how long that tunnel must have been.
I have no idea, but it's such a unique story that's why I remember it. Just thinking as a kid, wow, being in this tunnel and, because of course a kid's thinking of exploring the tunnel. But for him, I'm sure it was hard work.
So was that kind of where people would start, from what you have gleaned from your father, like sort of, these lower grade, like sweeping suds?
Probably, because I mean, my father wasn't a brewmaster. He knew nothing about making beer. So I'm sure, when you're a student, as he was, you try to get what jobs you can, and I'm sure something opened up for doing some menial jobs at the brewery. Come to think of it, I wonder if his brothers were there before him and got him a job, saying, hey, there's an opening, on the bottling floor or something like that, and a custodial job or something on the bottling floor, and then that kind of opened up maybe to the ice house or something like that. So I never really thought of that, but I bet that's what happened. One of his brothers had a job there first and then got him a job.
So while these accounts may be a little bit limited in their scope by the nature of them being secondhand stories, I think they each added such an invaluable piece to the greater picture. First we heard from Mark, who had the family angle, and his approach was, he can't remember the specifics, but he was left with this lasting impression that he'd never heard anything bad. He couldn't imagine there being labor strife or anything like that. Whereas in contrast, Paul Kaiser's firsthand account was definitely of, hard work, long hours, just a very difficult task that he was faced with, tight-fisted, Christian Heurich. So it was a very interesting contrast. And then, in the end, the story from Bill demonstrates that there really was that line between camaraderie and a strict work environment, the little kind of jokesters, but how much of a joke are having firecrackers thrown at you? But he really kind of heard those stories on repeat. He presented these informations as stories he'd heard multiple times passed down to him from his father's days at the brewery. And it really just provided a whole nother glimpse to a different side of working in the brewery.
Yeah, another important facet of what we wanted to learn about was kind of a bigger picture. What was the legacy of the brewery on the descendants of the brewery workers, either personally or for their family, and what they thought the brewery's legacy to the city is. Carlos Squire is a descendant from Christian Heurich's brother-in-law, who had a bottling plant where Heurich's beer was bottled for a number of years. She discussed the importance of place in the brewery's legacy.
I want to bring it back to DC a little bit. So when you learned the brewery was closing, you kind of felt that it was time and that was the natural order of things. How did you feel about what was built in the place of the brewery on that land by the Potomac?
Well, you see, that was the family's decision to donate that land,
Mm-hmm.
and which was fine. And the Kennedy Center is a wonderful institution, and what's underneath of it the brewery, the history is still there, even though the building isn't.
Mm-hmm. Like,
And
what do you mean by that?
In other words, the property is still there. The brewery was on it. It is still part of, you can't take away the history that the brewery was there.
Right.
I mean, I've got tons of pictures of the brewery and tons of things about the brewery that was there. It's an honor to have the Kennedy Center built on that property.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still, the history of the Heurichs is there and can't be taken away.
What do you think that the legacy of that brewery has been for the city? I know it's important for your family. What about kind of more generally?
I don't think in today's society, there might be 4% who care
About the brewery?
about the brewery, about anything in the days gone by.
But you think back in the Heurich's time and when your grandparents were alive, things were different, values were different. Maybe?
Oh, 400%. I am so lucky that I was born in 1931, because I lived in an era where 99% of the things that went on meant something. Things don't mean anything to these people today.
Interestingly, though, Carla's son, Chris Squire, is even farther removed from the brewery, but he definitely falls within the 4% of people who care. Chris has made it his mission to collect memorabilia from the Christian Heurich Brewing Company and also the Arlington Bottling Company, which was his family side of the business. For many years, he too worked in the beverage industry. And, he's active on Facebook and Ancestry.com and is always on the lookout for a new family connection or collectible. And he really sees himself as the keeper of that family legacy in many ways, but he laments how much has not been passed down and has already been lost to history.
Want to ask, did you ever get a sense from your grandfather maybe or your mom about how people felt when the Heurich Brewing Company closed?
I didn't. I really didn't know much about it other than the Heurich House. I knew there was this house of a castle, and everybody called it, this castle.
And you're like connected to it in some way.
I sat on DuPont Circle, and all I knew is the brewery was at the end of Whitehurst Freeway, and that they sold the brewery to the Kennedy Center, and is where Kennedy Center sits today.
Yeah.
That's really all I knew. That's all that was ever really told. So I never really, again, growing up, I didn't grow up in that computer era in state, so I didn't have a way of researching other than talking to relatives. And I didn't have any relatives. So my mom was an only child. My aunt, I'd never really talked to her about it because I just didn't know.
You didn't know to ask.
And my mom's cousins, my mom's the oldest. And so her cousins were never around. And they didn't seem to care. And now that I've talked to them, they really didn't know. They knew they were related, but it wasn't part of them. They didn't.
So when I asked him how he felt about this loss of the family history, here's what he said.
Yeah.
So that kind of sometimes frustrates me a little. I think right now I'm satisfied in things that I do know and can pass on to my kids.
Seems like you do know a lot of great stories and great things.
I do. I consider myself, I guess, a storyteller. I know a little things about maybe a lot, though, because I collect a lot of things.
I just love the picture that's in the backdrop that shows a lot of his collection. It's really fantastic. And I know that there's more where that came from that is not in the picture. Now, kind of different from Chris's memories in some ways are Mark Kaiser's memories. He can only speculate about some of his family history, like how Christian Heurich might have helped his relatives by paying for their educations. And he lamented how those details about how his family was given a leg up can get lost over the years, even if they remain really important to the family's legacy.
What do you think that Christian's legacy in maybe the broader DC world was? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I think knowing the size of the brewery and the number of people he employed, I think his impact down there must have been substantial. I think he owned I think it was the largest private company in DC, didn't he?
Yeah.
And so the ripples in the pond must have just spread out tremendously down there.
Yeah. I mean, I know that first of all, he employed a lot of people. And I think that he really gave a lot of opportunities, particularly to German immigrants and German Americans. I know a lot of them worked at the brewery. Mm-hmm. I talked to the son of the last comptroller of the brewery, and it sounds like that job at the brewery kind of helped firmly position that family in the middle class and vaulted him to other good career opportunities once the brewery had closed. So yeah, I often wonder, how many people like that are out there who had a similar story of kind of, being helped on their way to achieve the American dream through their connections.
And if my suspicion is correct that he helped my grandfather in his education, he's done the same for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that legacy.
Yeah. I think unfortunately, I guess, after so many generations pass, people sort of forget from whom they benefited from ultimately. And I guess maybe at some point it doesn't matter anymore, but, certainly people were given a leg up,
Yeah.
Other narrators I talked to, like Bill Jones, had a very concrete idea about how working at the brewery had given his father and in turn his family a higher standard of living than many of his neighbors.
Would you say that the legacy of your dad working at the Heurich Brewery has been on your family and on you?
I mean, it was the start of bigger and better things. So my dad got his start as a bookkeeper, auditor, and doing business things, which apparently was good enough to get him a job with the union. And then, of course, being a union executive, I mean, he was set for life after that. So it put food on the table and gave us a standard of living that probably a lot of my neighborhood kids didn't have.
Do you think it's important for people to know the story of the Heurich Brewery and its employees today?
I mean, not so much the fact that there was a brewery at one time in Washington. I think more important is things that went on that probably influenced Washington, like that they took care of their own, that they took care of their community, and that their position in society is more important than the product that they were producing. That would probably be the thing.
So one of the most interesting comparisons, I think, from all of those different clips was really that we had the opportunity to get the perspectives from mother and son, Carla and Chris Squire. It was such a unique approach. Carla was lamenting how the younger generation doesn't really care anymore. And then we heard from Chris himself as the younger generation kind of lamenting how he didn't get enough from the older generation, from how the older generation didn't care enough to pass things on. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating to get their conflicting sides of the story, of the same story. And Chris also brought about the interesting connection between collecting and legacy, which obviously as a museum, we're very interested in. Chris was unique among the descendants that we interviewed in his desire to actively collect and acquire any Heurich memorabilia to actively pass down to generations, to pass down to his kids. Whereas a lot of other people we interviewed were more only interested in what they had already that was specifically connected to their family as their way of preserving legacy. Or conversely, then some people like Bill Jones, he's actually donated quite a few things from his father to the museum. And that's how he has approached kind of collecting and preserving his family's memory and his family's legacy. And so there's just a lot of different ways how people feel what their legacy means to them and how to best preserve it. But I do think ultimately one of the most interesting discussions of legacy that we had here is the idea really of the lasting impact of the opportunities for upward mobility, along with the support of the strong German American community that was provided by the brewery. And I think that was definitely one of the really strong takeaways from all of those interviews. And now I know we played you a lot of clips and we're running over on our time here. So we definitely want to hear from if any of you have questions. Turn it back over to Jasper.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks, Anne. It's a really great presentation. I really appreciate the time you took selecting those clips. Very well curated, and I think they give us a really good sense of kind of the overall topics and themes that came out of your project. We do it looks like we do have some questions that are coming in from the audience. So I think we're going to have a really great Q&A session. There's just a couple of things that I wanted to ask first, if that's all right. One of the things that we try to get to in the coffee chats is, not only the topics and themes, the, kind of interpretations that have come out of these oral histories, but we also try to get an idea of the process. Because, if there's, anything we can do to kind of help people think through, potential projects of their own, get an idea of what it takes to do a project like this, that's something that we want to talk about through the coffee chats as well. So I'm just wondering if you all can tell us a little bit more about the museum's motivation for conducting this project. I know that a big part of it is kind of recovering that lost history, through the destruction of those archives. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about kind of how the idea for the project started.
Yeah, as I mentioned, when we acquired that huge collection of Breweriana, it didn't really tell us that much. So the exhibit that we have up right now, we organized the items kind of by different themes of production, marketing, employee life. but we, have a few group photos of employees, but, even those, we don't really know who the people are. We don't know their stories. And that's something that, we really wanted to be able to capture. So much of the motivation for this was to try to capture as much as we can of what's left out there from, any surviving descendants, those little stories that we've heard over the years. As collections manager, sometimes I'll get emails just from people out of the blue saying, hey, my grandfather, worked in this position at the brewery, can you tell me anything? Or, they'll say, oh, I have this one story, but that's all I have. And so we were hoping to draw, more of those histories out of people, just to try to support what we already have in the brewery exhibit. So that was definitely part of the motivation behind the project, for sure.
Thanks. Yeah. I feel like I should say that the power just went out at my house again. So if you lose me, please do feel free to continue with the program. I know there's a lot of questions that the audience wants to ask, but one more thing, just in case that happens, that was really interesting to me about this project, and I definitely wanted to get to in this moderated conversation part, is this idea that your project is somewhat unique, at least among the projects that have been funded by the collaborative, and that the narrators, for the most part, were relating received memories instead of, not instead of, but in addition to their own lived experiences. And in some ways that kind of, kind of goes back to more traditional forms of storytelling. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about the way that might affect like interpretation of the oral history interviews, or the way researchers might use them.
Yeah, I think with any oral history, it's important to kind of take it with a grain of salt, as memories are very subjective, whether they're firsthand or received memories. We got three really, who had firsthand memories. Paula through her grandfather's writings, and then Jan Evans and Carla Squire, who had been children when the brewery was still open. But, at other moments, we really had to balance a narrator who had secondhand information and their own life stories with the received memories. So one way that we tackled that was to make it more about how the legacy of the brewery impacted the narrators' families and their own lives. In the clips, we heard about how working in the brewery had helped Bill Jones and his family kind of achieve more of a middle-class lifestyle. So that legacy, combined with the received memories that his father had, kind of paint us a fuller picture that gets at both the narrator's memories and the memories from the brewery.
Great. Yeah, I think that it's definitely something that like might make your oral history collection and potentially growing oral history collection kind of unique in many ways. I think that I think that like some of your narrators, just in the clips that we heard, like it's interesting that they themselves were also kind of like speculating why certain memories from that they had heard from parents and older generations might have stuck out to them, and I think that there's like kind of like this different layer that your oral histories kind of get to, and like why kids remember things that are told to them by their elders and things like that. So yeah, I think that it's a great example of how oral history projects like are meant to capture life histories, but they can also capture history that you might not be able to get to across the generations. A lot of times with the coffee chats, we also have some narrators who are actually on the panel, and it's kind of like unfortunate that we weren't able to do that this time, but like great that you were able to bring in so many narrators' voices. But one of the questions that we would normally ask those narrators is how they felt being interviewed for the project, or if they were nervous, or if there were any things that kind of helped them feel more comfortable. So I wondered if you have any thoughts about that. Were your narrators prepared to be interviewed? Was it a new experience for them? Was there any hesitancy? And did you use any techniques to kind of make them feel more comfortable?
Yeah, I can speak first to, just getting people to agree in the first place. And then, I know Anne actually had the experience interviewing everyone, but yeah, we struggled with getting people to agree to do it in the first place because it seems like people didn't think that their memories were that valid or that interesting or that important, or that they really didn't know enough to do an oral history. And so we ran into that a lot. And I reached out to pretty much anyone over the years who had sent me any kind of an email saying, my grandfather worked there, or just any tie. And a lot of people just didn't answer, or then we got, a lot of people just saying like, this is the only story I know. This is the only fact I know. Like, I don't have enough to give you an oral history, which was kind of sad, obviously, on our end, because we're like, tell us anyway. We'd love to hear from you. But so, these few people that did agree, as a lot of them do have the family ties too, like Mark Kaiser and Jan Evans. And so it was interesting trying to get people to agree to do it in the first place, because I think a lot of people undervalue their own experiences. And then Anne, I don't know if you have anything to add about your pre-interviews with them or how any of that went.
Sure. Yeah. So the few people who did express interest after Allison had reached out, I then conducted a long pre-interview phone call with them, usually sometimes Zoom, but usually a phone, to kind of have it be a media that they were more familiar with, because this was the beginning of the pandemic. Not everybody was great with Zoom. Some of our narrators didn't even have internet or computers. So my job at that point was to just have a conversation with them and ask them about the memories that they'd mentioned and try to get them talking about other memories that might be useful. And oftentimes what would happen is that we might have, a 45-minute conversation about stories that had popped into their mind. And at that point I could say, a lot of these things are really, really valuable. I think you do really have a lot to share for an oral history. Would you do a formal oral history interview? And so I think that taking the time in those pre-interview calls was crucial to making them see the value of their own experiences and family memories. And then, a tip that we heard from day one in our oral history trainings was let the narrator speak and don't interrupt. And I really tried hard to do that, because I found that, letting them continue talking and maybe go off on a tangent would often bring them to an important memory or a little bit of information that was really valuable.
Great. Yeah, definitely. The hardest thing I think sometimes is to, let narrators take the time that they need to kind of, think through what they want to say. And the tendency is to fill those silences. I think it's just human nature. So, yeah, absolutely. I think that, what we should do now is turn to some of these questions from the audience. It looks like people are really, interested in asking a little bit more questions about the brewery and about, some of the history that was uncovered. So I will, and it looks like Kim Bender has been able to answer some of the questions as well. Thanks, Kim, for joining us. Let's see, Carol Thornhill asks, did the brewery employ Blacks at any time? And where did the employees of the brewery tend to live?
Yeah, so that's a great question, obviously, and that's something that we are actively looking into. One of the donations actually from Bill Jones, we were extremely fortunate to get, is a collection of over 600 brewery or cards from an employee credit union that was at the brewery. So from that collection, we have names. And so something that we have been really trying to do is individually research these names. It's a huge project. We're looking at ancestry, old newspaper records, and everything. So we're trying to start to gather demographic information. There's addresses on there. And so that's something that we are doing hand in hand with this oral history project, which is great, which is really just trying to dig into the personal stories. So in one sense, we don't really know a lot about the demographics there. We do know that in large part, he employed a lot of German Americans. That was something that, was really important to him, was to support the German American community. But we do know that there were certainly African Americans that were employed there at some time. We have one great picture. There's an African American truck driver for the brewery that's going out and doing deliveries. We do know that there were some communications I think there was like a union for drivers and things. So it's something that we are hoping to uncover a lot more about, and it's something we are actively looking into. And I'm sorry, I believe there's another part of that question.
The other part was, and the same answer might apply. Where did the employees tend to live?
Oh, yes. Yeah. We do believe that a lot of the employees lived down by the brewery there. So the brewery is where the Kennedy Center is today. And we believe that a lot of the employees lived in that area.
Great. So we do have a few more questions that are in the chat, but at this point, since we're opening things up to the Q&A, I would recommend that if you have any questions, please put them in that kind of Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. You also have the option of using the raise hand function if you'd like to ask your question aloud. But we have another question from Carol Thornhill in the chat. She asked, did the brewery experience anti-German feelings during the World Wars? And if they did, how did they cope?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's another one we don't know a whole lot about. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but this is exactly where we're trying to get any input we can from passed down stories. We know that the Heurich family themselves experienced a lot of anti-German sentiment, but we are not aware of any stories specifically against the brewery, at least not that I know of at this point. But it was definitely real. We don't know a lot about if there was dips in sales because of his Germanness, but something that, we're very interested in as well.
Okay, great. And then we have a question in the chat from Burke Dillon, and I believe that Burke has a few questions in the Q&A as well. But in the chat, Burke asks, any more about how narrowly employment was focused on Germans and how they were recruited?
We do know that a lot of it was, family relations. So, ties. Amelia's own brother worked there. We know that one gentleman who used to work for the family as their chauffeur ended up working in the bottling plant. We think a lot of it, was kind of just word of mouth. There was a very tight-knit German American community at the time. And so it seemed like Christian really looked out for anybody who needed a job. We heard that especially after Prohibition, anybody who had been employed by him before, children of previous employees, we know that he very actively tried to give jobs to anybody who needed one that had any German American ties. So we know that there was a very narrow focus there, and he really tried to be supportive of family, descendants, anybody. It was really, as I think Mark Kaiser commented on, it really was like a family there for a lot of people, it seemed.
I'll jump in here too. Bill Jones's father, Parker, was not of German descent, but his story kind of fit the pattern of a sibling probably worked there and got him a job. And I remember asking Bill if his father had ever kind of felt like an outsider because, he didn't speak German or he wasn't German. And Bill didn't remember any stories that he had. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. But I think it's important to point out too that, the last employee of this very German brewery wasn't of German descent, although the main group who was employed there, we believe, were of course Germans and German Americans.
Great. And we have a good follow-up to the question that Carol asked in the chat. John Goodman asked, didn't he change the pronunciation of his last name during World War I?
So from what we know, it was always pronounced Heurich once he was in America. We believe that he Americanized it very early on. We don't have an exact date to that, but I think that was really common just among German immigrants. I know my own German grandparents did the same thing, changed spellings. So we don't know that that was specifically related to World War I. We know that they ran campaigns about it of, say hi, Rick, where they spelled it differently. That was later in the 80s. So as far as we know that they did that back very early on.
All right, so we'll move over to the Q&A now. Burke has a question there. What was where the Watergate is now, i.e. with the brewery on one side and the worker houses on the other side? Were there more of the worker houses?
I'm not entirely sure that I know the answer to that specifically. We know that the brewery was located, I don't know how to show you with my hands. It was like the Kennedy Center was here and the brewery would have shared a bit, overlapped the land there a little bit. And then as far as we know, a lot of the employees just kind of lived down in just in the surrounding neighborhoods.
And then I think, maybe like a follow-up to that question would be, Burke also asked in the chat, you've said nothing about the charming little European houses that are part of historic Foggy Bottom. We were always told they were built by Heurich. Is that a myth?
I'm not sure.
All right, that's an interesting thing to look into. We have a question from Gerald Strauf. Is there a historical exhibit at the brewery now? Have enjoyed the insights and the oral histories presented.
Yes, the brewery itself was torn down in 1961, 62. So the brewery doesn't exist anymore. But at the museum right now, we do have in the historic carriage house is where our homebrewed exhibit is that features all of the breweriana that we have and where we are going to put these oral histories up on display as part of an interactive element of the exhibit.
Great, and we have another question in the Q&A from Stephanie Mills Trice, who asks, as a native Washingtonian, I remember hearing stories of the brewery and a significant presence of African Americans in the area due to work offered. Have you in your research uncovered other factories, mills, and general major employment in the area, as well as African American presence at the brewery?
Yeah, unfortunately, as I said, we don't have a lot of that demographic information as of yet. We are hoping to uncover more of that. But the brewery archives, as I said, given the fire in the archives that destroyed so many of the records, there's just very few records that still remain. So, oral histories, as you say, that kind of memory is great. And it's exactly what we're trying to dig into further. So hopefully we'll have an answer to that, soon once we work through more of the cards that we have in our collection. And hopefully, as we publicize this, more people hear, that we are preserving the history of the brewery and looking into workers. That's exactly where people start to come out of the woodwork. And that's been really rewarding for us working at the museum, is that, people are starting to seek us out. And so this is something where part of spreading the word, getting people to share more of those stories, finding more connections and uncovering a lot more of these silenced histories. And that's really what we're trying to do at this time.
Great.
Yeah.
And
I was
sorry.
just going to jump in to add that, the area of Georgetown is not far from where the brewery was, and that had been a historically Black neighborhood while the brewery was in operation during its earlier years, at least. So that could be part of what the person who asked the question had heard about. But again, as Allison says, we can't really determine what the connections between that population and the brewery were quite yet.
All right. While we, wait for some more questions to come into the Q&A, and everybody please feel free to ask more. Actually, we do have another question from Deborah Thomas. Thank you. Will you be doing a future presentation on the staff who worked at the house?
Yeah, we've actually been working on an exhibit that we're hoping to open soon, as soon as COVID allows, that we've been doing in tangent to researching the brewery workers. We have been researching individually people who worked for the Heurich family. We've gone through a lot of primary source materials. We have diaries in our collection, letters, other oral histories with Jan herself and Jan's mother, Carla, who was one of the Heurich's children. And so we've been trying to pull names out of any sources we can find there as well to uncover additional silenced histories. And so we're doing the same individual research. We have a great education team that's been helping with this. And we've been trying to just find individual stories to highlight, looking at ancestry again, newspaper articles, oral histories, and everything to uncover again, the same kind of demographic information, life trajectories, upward mobility. We're really trying to dig into all of that to, again, just uncover these other stories that help to build the Heurich success and the Heurich legacy. You know, so they certainly didn't do it on their own. And so we're really trying to dig into that much deeper and really recognize that, you know, they didn't get to their point of success by themselves. So yes, hand in hand, looking at household staff, brewery workers, all of the people that supported the Heurich family's success.
Great. And so I actually have another question that kind of, to kind of build off of that. What are some additional next steps for this project? Are there, like in addition to the interpretations that you're just discussing about the household staff, are there any ideas about, doing any additional interviews or how would you incorporate the interviews you've already done into the museum's future interpretive plan?
Yeah, doing more interviews that's the dream, and that's exactly what we're hoping to uncover more descendants through the individual research that we are doing now. And, through featuring programs like this, hopefully if anyone, can see a program like this and really understand that their stories are important and they're relevant. We definitely have done some additional interviews with people. We've interviewed some modern brewers to try to capture their side of this story, other people that have contacted us. So yes, absolutely, we would love to do more oral histories. And that's what's great about this, is that as we're trying to include a listening station in our exhibit, or both of our exhibits really, that we're working on. And, we can constantly add to that. We'd love these to be resources that anyone can access, because there's so many different topics and themes that are covered. So, it depends on what somebody doing research is really looking for there. We plan to have any of these oral histories available. So next steps, definitely more oral histories. And, we're very fortunate now with this grant that we received that we are set up with that equipment. We have the knowledge and the training and the equipment. And the pandemic actually, in a sense, forced us to be more ready to be flexible. Phone interviews, Zoom interviews, in-person interviews. We're ready to capture whatever is necessary, which is great. So that's certainly a next step, as well as I mentioned, the research that we're just doing on individual people to try to uncover more of their stories and hopefully find connections to people that are still in the DC area today.
Yeah, definitely seems like, some great possibilities there for the future of this project. So Burke Dillon asked another question in the Q&A. Would you be interested in doing programs for current Foggy Bottom resident groups?
I'm not the program manager, so I can't really speak to that, but absolutely. We always want to make connections with people. We always want to connect. Part of what we are looking to do is, make connections with the modern world. It's hard as a historic house museum, this big Victorian mansion, part of our mission is to connect to DC today, to connect to residents today, to, understand what our place is in the broader DC community and to just make those kinds of connections. So I said, I'm not a programming person, but ultimately that's, what we're here to do, is to be part of the broader DC community.
Yeah, I think that's definitely helpful to know that the Heurich Museum is interested in doing programs for the community and reaching out and like really being involved in kind of local history and the interpretation and documentation and preservation of that local history as well. Definitely feel free to continue asking, questions in the Q&A. Actually, we have another one that came in just now. Another question from Carol Thornhill. Carol asks, are you studying the property records for the lifetime of the brewery to note the changes over time as who owned and when in the area of Foggy Bottom and nearby?
Yeah, the property records is another huge project that we have. We have endless projects queued up. But yes, Heurich was, as we mentioned, he was one of the largest non-governmental employers, but also largest non-governmental landowners. So there are extensive property records. He owned so many properties all over DC. So outside of the brewery too, he had just a lot of rental properties and land. And so he was definitely a huge landowner, and that is a big part of something that we are trying to look into, again, in relation to, demographic information, who was he renting to, who lived in these properties, what was he, a fair owner, all of those kinds of questions. So that is absolutely something that, we are, again, looking into. There's so many interesting facets to his life and his life story, and that's a big one as well, for sure.
All right, and I see that Kimberly Robinson has put a couple of questions into the chat. Do you have any information about Christian Heurich and the connection with the orphanage? Is the first question.
And he was
sorry,
on the board.
I think that I'm sorry. I just realized that the second question kind of follows on from that. Christian Heurich was on the board of the German Orphan Asylum, and I recall seeing on the Ladies' Aid Society rosters held at the Kiplinger Library that his wife was also on the Ladies' Aid Society.
Yeah, he was well known for his philanthropic efforts, for sure. And yes, he was on the board of the German Orphan Society and the Oldest Inhabitants, and all of that. And then we know he gave a lot of donations to just a lot of German societies. But outside of his role on the board, we're not really sure how actively he participated with the Orphan Society. I'm sure there was monetary donations, but we don't know that much more about his role in the broader sense. But again, that German American community was so important to him. And, as similarly as we see him trying to employ German Americans in the brewery, he also looked out for just anyone in the German community to try to give them a place and a leg up. And, we know that was something that was very important to him. And, he donated a lot to his hometown. He created some foundations there. And yeah, he was definitely very active with his philanthropy, and Amelia as well. His wife was equally interested and equally supportive of foundations like that.
Great. I wanted to also kind of just go back again to, some of the stories that came from the oral history project. As I said, I think you all did a fantastic job of curating the clips that we heard today. But I was wondering if, besides those that you pulled out for this presentation, if there are any stories that stand out to you as particularly revealing or inspirational or even entertaining.
Well, I think that, we've shared the big ones that are directly about the brewery. I mean, I love the firecracker story. That is far and away my favorite one. But one that I remember was actually related to Carlos Squire's experiences of being a child in Washington during World War II. She talked a lot about her memories of, having to pull the blinds down in her Petworth apartment for air raid drills, and about using ration books to purchase things like, one pair of shoes a year or every so many months or whatever, because leather was rationed, and same thing with food items. And she was able to really go into detail about that time. But what was interesting was that she was very adamant about, in spite all all of those precautions that they had to take, she was never afraid. Like, she always felt very safe in Washington as a child, even during that global conflict. And that's kind of stuck with me.
Mhm. All right. Another thing that we've asked several of the project directors who have been on the coffee chats who are doing oral histories from the same cohort was what impact COVID-19 had on your project, because I know that in 2020 the DCOHC cohort kind of found out that they had received the grant and that the project was going to get started pretty much at the same time that things started shutting down, and it became a lot more difficult to meet with people in person. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what kind of pivots you had to make, how things had to change, what sort of impact those changes had on the project.
Yeah, I can speak first to some of the positive impacts for us, and then Anne is a little bit more in the trenches on that one. But for us, in a sense, we got fortunate because as a lot of our interviewees were relating secondhand stories from their parents and their life in DC, not a lot of them actually lived in DC. I think we interviewed someone in either North or South Carolina, someone was, I believe, in New Hampshire, so it was actually very fortunate for us because we were able to capture stories of people that were a little more far flung, capture certainly the stories of Washington, DC history, but the pandemic in a sense actually set us up to have the remote interviewing systems in place. So it did actually allow us to interview even more people than we would have had access to otherwise. But Anne, maybe I'll throw this one over to you then for a little more of the nitty gritty.
Sure. It was kind of a blessing in that we didn't really have a setup for in-person interviews yet. So we kind of hit the ground running, knowing that we were going to have to find a way to do them virtually. And so, that just meant doing research into how to accomplish that with the highest possible recording quality, figuring out podcasting software to conduct interviews, which turned out to be really helpful. I think we used Zencaster for it. But aside from sort of those technical challenges, one thing that I remember was sort of, people's very, in some cases isolated, in other cases emotionally kind of vulnerable states during the summer of 2020, which was still really the height of the pandemic. And it was clear that some of the narrators hadn't really had people to talk to very much at all. And then here's this stranger coming in asking them to share all of these memories and family memories and talk about how they feel about things. And it could get pretty emotional at times. It could also lead to a lot of tangents just because this person was happy to have someone to talk to. So for me as a new oral historian, I tried to be as empathetic and patient and gentle with these folks as I could be, while also kind of trying to guide them and keep them on track a little bit when they'd veered too far off course. And of course, being willing to work with narrators who had maybe, shared something that in hindsight they didn't want to be made public. And of course, we were happy to work with them on that too.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in a lot of ways. That's something that's presented so much challenges, across the world, has also kind of, reduced the distance between people in some ways, and has allowed projects like this to, reach people that, wouldn't have been possible to before. I know that, if it was 2018 and we were doing one of the DCOHC interviewer training workshops, we would have considered Zoom or a virtual interview as a complete last resort, and would have, recommended that, the interview be conducted in person, or it might wait until it could be conducted in person. But, with COVID-19, that certainly wasn't possible. And so many of these projects are, they need to be done, and they need to be done kind of within the timeline that's set out for them and everything. Yeah, I think that, that's been the case for a lot of projects, is that they found that they were able to expand the list of people that they could potentially interview. It's made the projects a lot larger in some ways. I do want to, just ask, I know that we haven't had a question come into the Q&A for a few minutes now. Does anybody else have any questions that they would like to ask the panel? Are there any kind of comments on some of the topics and themes that have come out of this project? Anything that people would like to say? You can feel free to raise your hand, and Tracy can unmute you so you can speak aloud as well if you like. If not, there's only one more question that I would have, and that's, if you have any tips or kind of advice for people who might be listening who want to, think about starting their own community oral history project. What did you find that worked really well? What sort of challenges did you encounter that people might want to be on the lookout for?
I think Anne mentioned my biggest takeaway was, we already talked about this, but to just let people talk. Like, it's shocking what happens if you just, like you said, don't fill those silences. I know I conducted an oral history after this project for our household staff exhibit. And, I introduced my voice for the recording, and I asked them to introduce themselves for the recording, and they talked for 20 minutes straight. And it was fantastic. They were just so excited to just tell their life story to somebody. And, just, it felt, strange just being silent, but he told so many wonderful stories. And so it's so hard to fight that urge to ask the follow-up question in the flow of conversation. But that was the biggest thing. And I know I've listened to plenty of old oral histories in our collections, and where everyone's talking over each other. And it's really frustrating because then people lose their train of thought. So if you're starting your own, really the power of silence is not to be undervalued. And I would also say, it can't hurt to ask, even with someone you don't think would, be willing to give you an oral history, just ask people if they'd be willing to talk to you. And I think, having Anne do that sort of preliminary call with people eased a lot of concerns. Because, I think that's not exactly a normal thing to be asked to record yourself talking about yourself for a few hours. And I know people are like, well, what are you going to ask about? What kinds of things should I talk about? Like, I need to have this prepared, I got to do my research, look into all this kind of stuff. So I think there is a fair amount of kind of easing nerves that go into it, just let people know sort of what to expect, and that, casual conversation. And I think you can tell that people sort of relax into the interviews, and it becomes just a little more conversational. And I do think that's probably something that in-person interviews help with a little more than a phone call and a Zoom. But I think those were some of my takeaways. But Anne, I'll throw that back over to you.
Yeah, those are all super, super important takeaways. I'll just add, like, the importance of really planning. Plan to spend lots of time on this, more time than you think, and have a plan for what you're going to do with the recordings afterwards and with the transcripts afterwards. And, be sure that you are ready to devote a lot of time to researching these people and to transcribing and all of that. And the oral history collaborative trainings really drove that home and prepared us to do that. So we were well positioned to kind of keep that in mind. But I think that sometimes new oral historians, and I include myself in this, before I went through the training, I was just excited to do the interview, and I hadn't thought much about what's before and what's after, but there's so much more time and planning that goes into it to have a really robust conversation, and then really make good use of that interview and make it publicly available if that's what you want to do.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you again for both the excellent presentation. It was great to hear so much more about your project and to dig a little bit deeper. For providing such thoughtful answers to everybody's questions as well. I will just take one more stab here to see if anybody has anything else they want to ask. If you do, please do go ahead and put that in the Q&A. But if not, then I would just say take a look at the chat, because I believe that Tracy put the link to the Dig DC archive, the People's Archive at the DC Public Library, where the Homebrewed Oral History Project collection is archived. You can find a lot of oral histories that have been conducted by DCOHC project directors over the years at Dig DC. So please do go ahead and check those out. I hope that you will continue to join us for these coffee chats in the coming months. We're finalizing some plans for the November and December coffee chats now. So we look forward to seeing you back at those. And please do also, if you're interested in conducting oral histories, about Washington, D.C., be on the lookout for DC Oral History Collaborative grant opportunities and training opportunities as well. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.